Hi, I'm Peter Kavanagh and welcome back to Paul and Power, our short series on the wonderful, miraculous ministry of the Holy Spirit in the life of Paul, but also reflecting on the fact that Paul wasn't Superman, that the epistles and other parts of the Bible reveal that he had doubts and fears and difficulties just like all of us. Now, here's a really good one for you. Galatians, please, chapter 4. And I'm reading from verse 13. Have a look at this. Galatians 4 and verse 13. Paul is, in the midst of his letter to them, remembering his arrival in Galatia when he first went to preach the gospel to them. And we'll come on to that in just a sec. But here he says this, as you know, verse 13, it was because of an illness that I first preached the gospel to you. Even though my illness was a trial to you, you notice that? Even though it was a trial, you didn't treat me with contempt or scorn. He goes on to say, you treated me as though I were an angel, as though I were Jesus himself. And then in verse 15 he says, in fact, if you could have done, he says, you would have torn out your own eyes and given them to me. So some have speculated that maybe the problem Paul had was his eyesight, but he doesn't really clearly say that. We don't know what it was. What we do know is when he describes it as a trial, the fact that he remembers it and the fact that they looked after him in his illness suggests that, he didn't have a cold. He didn't have a bit of a bad back, but that something really quite serious was askew with his health at the time that he wrote that. And it's not just here either. Well, I won't comment on Paul's thorn in the flesh spoken of in 2 Corinthians 12 because that is quite obscure. But in 1 Corinthians 2, the passage we read in our last part, Paul says there among his many obstacles at Corinth, we were talking about him being afraid and trembling and nervous. But he also says there in that passage that he was weak. Weak. Now, that might mean weak in spirit, weak of heart, nervous. But actually, as I read that, I think of that to mean weak in body, i.e. ill or physically not tip-top. Well, what an amazing encouragement that should be to all of us. Because it means that when Paul operated in his ministry, sometimes he was unwell, but the Spirit could still powerfully move through him, even to the healing of other people. This is amazing, isn't it? Now, it shouldn't really surprise us all that much, because the very first healing recorded in the Bible is found in Genesis chapter 20. So the first time anyone gets miraculously healed as a response to prayer is actually in the household of Abimelech, where Abraham prays for them, for the slave girls, the servants working in the house, because they are barren, and the Lord cures their barrenness. Now, at first, it just looks like an interesting story, a wonderful story, wonderful for them to be healed. But when you look at the chronology, it's even more amazing because, Genesis 20 comes before Genesis 21. And in Genesis 21, Isaac is born. And if you're connecting the dots, you'll know what I mean. That in fact, when Abram prayed for the household of Abimelech to be cured of barrenness, he was barren himself. So the first person to pray for the sick in the Bible was not well. Well, what an amazing encouragement that can be for us. I remember one time I'd been booked to preach in a very small church in Essex. And they wanted to have a healing meeting. Said, okay, I'll come. I'll pray for the sick, see if God will touch anybody. But as that date arrived, I came down and I can't remember what, but it was something like the flu. I was exhausted. I had to just lay in a bed and just, sleep it off, But then suddenly it was Sunday night and I had to make this meeting. And I remember being driven to that meeting. I showed up and I pretended that I was healthy just for a couple of hours, And I remember in that meeting, a man came in and the Lord touched his knee. And in fact, his knee made a noise as it was healed. And the Lord took away all the pain and brought back mobility to this man's knee, so much so that even a year later, he gave his testimony on the radio, on the BBC. Now, so that was a wonderful miracle, but all the more amazing was that as soon as that meeting was over, I said to the guy who was with me, please take me home. I need to get back to bed. Well, I couldn't begin to tell you how many times as I travelled around Brazil, how sick I was and how ill I was. I won't go into it, but let's just say my body didn't get on with all the food. I think I was also reacting to my anti-malaria tablets too. And so I was ill pretty much every day that I was ministering. And yet, sometimes 20, 30 people would testify a night that God had touched them in some wonderful way. Well, I certainly knew it wasn't me. Now, you might ask the question, well, why didn't the power that flowed through me, why couldn't it flow to me? Why couldn't my need be met? The answer is, I have no idea. But all I know is this, that I was in good company with Paul and indeed with Abraham. And so you might be thinking to yourself, well, I can't really operate in the power of the Holy Spirit. I've got so many unanswered prayers. I've got so many needs. I need a miracle myself. But actually, that shouldn't stop you. That shouldn't stop you from ministering at all. Because the power is His, not ours. We are the jar of clay. And He is the treasure. There's a reason why Paul travelled with a physician, There's a reason why he sends word to his colleague in the ministry, his son in the faith, Timothy, 1 Timothy 5:23, and say, you better take your medicine, son, because Timothy had frequent stomach upsets, as we know. You can read that there. There's a reason why Paul rejoiced greatly in the Lord as God would minister sometimes to his needs. There were times when he said, I've learned the secret of being content. Sometimes I haven't got everything I need. He says that over in Philippians 4. So I want to encourage you. You don't have to have everything all together. You don't have to know what God is doing in your life to be able to prophesy to others. Let me finish with this interesting thought. We read earlier that Paul wrote to the Galatians that it was because of an illness that he preached to them and they looked after him. Now, here's something interesting. In 1899, William Ramsey, one of the great Bible scholars of his day, wrote a commentary, a historical commentary on the book of Galatians. And in that commentary, he suggested that southern Galatia was the area to which the book of Galatians was being written. There's a North Galatia, there's a southern Galatia. Well, here's the interesting thing. If Ramsey was right, and if Galatians was written to South Galatia, and that's a view that I would hold, but of course nobody really knows. But if Ramsey's right, then here's something even more amazing. It means that when Paul said he was ill in Galatians 4, that was maybe not the same day, maybe not the same week, but certainly at the same season of time that we were reading about in our first part, in Acts 14, in Iconium, and in Lystra, and in Derbe and Antioch. That's South Galatia, and that was the very place where Paul said to a lame man, "Stand up on your feet," where he and Barnabas were enabled to do signs and wonders, Luke says. It's the very place where they sacrificed to Barnabas and Paul, thinking that they were the Greek gods come down in human form. How ironic that Paul at that time was probably on medicines.